Chapter 25. The Last Clues. "I'll agree to call off the suit if we can come to some agreement," Peter Boonton said to Mr. Drew. "Under the terms of Ace's will, how much does each of our shares amount to?" "It is hard to say, because the suit has held up the sale of the estate," Mr. Drew replied. "I guess that it will total about $200,000. That will put the individual shares of yourself, your nieces, and the others at about $3,200 each." "What do you say, Jacob?" Peter asked his cousin. "Shall we call quits? That isn't a sum to be sneezed at." "Come to my office tomorrow and talk it over," Mr. Drew said. "I think the main business now is to find Sadie. Where is Nancy?" At that moment, a muffled scream reached the ears of the four men. "What was that? It came from the house!" Carson Drew exclaimed. "Quick, men! Inside!" "But how shall we get in?" Jacob cried. "It's all locked!" "Smash a window!" Mr. Drew shouted as another scream, this one louder and clearer, split the air. The four men rushed to the front of the mansion and up onto the porch. Mr. Drew snatched up an old folding chair and smashed in one of the window panes. He leaped through the opening, and the others crowded in after the lawyer. "Upstairs!" Mr. Drew commanded, rushing through the inky darkness toward the hall. Guided only by his memory of the interior and his sense of touch, he took the steps 2 at a time. The other men were not far behind. Up to the second floor, then up to the tower room. Mr. Drew hurled himself forward against the door of Ace's old room, beneath which light gleamed, and the door, unlocked, crashed open. The four men were confronted by an amazing and uncanny tableau. Nancy Drew's head and shoulders were framed in the window as if she were standing on air. Frank Semmet's arms were thrust through the opening in the act of pushing Nancy backward into nothingness, and the girl's hands were clutching the evil man's wrists to prevent her from falling. Clasping her arms around Semmet's waist and straining to pull him away from Nancy, Sadie Whipple was trying vainly with her puny strength to save her chum and benefactress. And there, just in the act of bringing down a heavy rod across Sadie's shoulders, stood Emma Semmet. "Stop!" thundered Mr. Drew, leaping forward. With one sweep of his arm, he sent Mrs. Semmet reeling aside. The next instant, his hands were gripping Semmet's throat. Mr. Hill quickly reached out to support Nancy, but not a moment too soon, for the crazy old ladder on which she was balanced crashed to the ground below. Jacob Sidney helped draw Nancy through the window to security, while Peter Boonton guarded the door toward which Emma Semmet had dashed in a hopeless attempt to save herself, regardless of what might befall her husband. "Let me go!" choked Semmet. Mr. Drew released the craven innkeeper, who staggered into a corner, clutching at his throat. "Are you all right, Nancy?" Mr. Drew asked, turning to his daughter. "Yes, indeed," Nancy answered. "You came just in the nick of time, however. And now let's call the police. I think Semmet and his wife will have plenty to answer for." "Oh, Nancy, I almost caused you to be hurt," Sadie cried. "It was my scream that revealed you to these people." "It was what warned us," Mr. Drew said. "Mr. Boonton, will you take a candle and find the telephone, please? Call the state police headquarters and ask them to send a squad down with a patrol car to take charge of 2 prisoners." As Peter hurried off on his errand, Nancy turned to Semmet. "Where is the watchman?" she demanded. "See if you can find out," was the snarled reply. "I can answer that," Sadie spoke up. "He forced me to ask the watchman to let us enter again, and the man recognized me, of course." Semmet stayed in the background so the guard would not recognize him, I guess. When the man turned to unlock the door, Semmet hit him over the head with something heavy and tied his arms and legs and then gagged him. He is now in the big clothes closet under the stairs. I'll get him out, Jacob Sidney volunteered eagerly, while Semmet darted a hateful look at his late associate in an attempt to break the will. The guard, shamefaced at having been trapped for a second time, eagerly took charge of the two prisoners, and if Frank Semmet had been left to his mercies, he would not have escaped with a whole skin. While we are waiting for the police to arrive, Mr. Drew said, sinking into a chair, "Let us get to the bottom of this confused state of affairs. First of all, I want to know how Nancy guessed the Semmets would be here," Mr. Hill cried. "Did you have some sort of a tip they would come back, Nancy?" "No, I had a hunch that whatever Semmet was after was in the house," Nancy said. "And it also seemed to me that Semmet would figure that the old mansion where he had trapped Sadie and me would be the last place anyone would look for him." "That is marvelous reasoning," Mr. Hill declared. "It certainly was the right solution, but I should never have thought of it." "Oh, yes, I'm sure you would have," Nancy protested. "I have never had such an exciting time before in my life," Mr. Hill said. "Oh, and that reminds me, I received a telegram from New Fernwild. A long one. It is in my office." "What did it say?" Nancy cried eagerly. "Your other remarkable hunch was well confirmed," Mr. Hill said. Asa Sidney contributed heavily to the orphanage after the second year that little Sadie was sheltered there, and when she was taken by the Semmets, Asa Sidney not only pledged himself as reference for them, but caused a beautiful playground and swimming pool to be built, to be called the Boonton Memorial Playground. "What's all this?" Mr. Drew demanded, sitting bolt upright. "How did you happen to get this information?" "Just by following Nancy's suggestions," Mr. Hill replied. "It proves, does it not, that Mr. Sidney had some sort of personal interest in Miss Whipple long before she ever saw him?" "What does it mean?" Sadie cried, looking from one to the other. "Who am I?" "That is something we do not know yet," Mr. Drew answered, smiling at his daughter with open respect and admiration. "However, I have no doubt that we shall soon learn." "Perhaps sooner than we expect," Nancy cried, rising and approaching the flat-topped desk on which the great twisted candle burned very low. With remarkable calm, she opened the battered old Bible and extracted the letter which she had been on the verge of reading when Semmet's ruse had interrupted her. "Here is a letter from the orphanage to Mr. Sidney, dated just before Sadie was taken by the Semmets," she said, opening the envelope and unfolding the sheet inside. Everyone in the room leaned forward tensely, watching Nancy closely as her eyes scanned the letter. Then she read aloud. "We beg to enclose all the information available about the child, Sadie Whipple. She was brought to this institution by the rector of St. James Church, into which she had wandered, and because she was not able to speak her name understandably, we followed the usual procedure of naming her after one of our contributors. Of course, a routine search was made for the child's relatives, and we learned that the baby's mother, a widow named Mrs. John Boonton, had been mortally injured in a street accident from which the little girl had escaped unhurt, and in the excitement had wandered away. Efforts to find any relatives of the parents were unsuccessful. They were strangers in the neighborhood, and a search of the meager belongings gave no trace of their kin. All eyes were now turned on Sadie, whose own eyes were bright with excitement and joy. "Then my name is really Boonton," she exclaimed. "I am related to Mr. Asa Sidney's wife. How strange. I wonder what my first name really is. I never cared for Sadie. Perhaps this will tell, Nancy said, dramatically touching the spring which caused the secret compartment in the top of the desk to fly open. She drew out the sheets of paper, and with them a thick-barreled fountain pen concealed inside. Nancy, how in the world do you learn such tricks? Mr. Drew exploded. Just by snooping around, Nancy smiled. Then suddenly the happy look faded as she scanned the papers. They were blank. That is certainly strange, Mr. Hill said. Why should Asa have taken such pains to conceal blank papers? Perhaps he was planning to write something which he wished kept secret, Mr. Drew said. And the end came before he was able to do it. Nancy made no comment. She was disappointed, but more than that, she was puzzled. The pen was heavy, and evidently it was filled. In her cogitation, Nancy absent-mindedly pressed the point of the pen onto one of the blank sheets. What she saw caused her to give a little gasp of surprise. Clear water seemed to flow from the point of the writing instrument. Just at that moment, the police van arrived, with siren wailing and searchlights combing the house. Mr. Drew and Mr. Hill descended to meet the troopers and to join in making the formal complaint against the Semets, who were guarded on the ground floor by the watchmen, Peter and Jacob. "Why, Nancy," Sadie said, turning to her friend, "aren't you going down also?" "No, I am not particularly keen on seeing anyone go to prison," Nancy said soberly. "The Semets well deserve it, of course, but I can't be of any use downstairs now. Besides, I have something very interesting here." "Oh, why are you burning up the papers?" Sadie cried. "Is there some bad news on them about me you want kept a secret?" "There is nothing on the papers anyone can see," Nancy replied. "So far, at any rate." She held the sheets close to the flame of the twisted candle, scanning them intently as she passed the papers over the flame. Soon steps were heard on the stairs, and Mr. Drew, Mr. Hill, and the two middle-aged cousins entered the tower room together. "Now we have nothing further to fear from the Semets at any rate," Mr. Drew said with a satisfied sigh of relief. "What in the world are you doing, Nancy?" "Just a moment now." Then she turned to the puzzled group with a radiant face. "The sheets were inscribed in invisible ink," Nancy announced. "The pen found with the papers seemed to be filled with water, and that gave me a clue. Most invisible inks turn dark under heat. And look!" She held up the sheets of paper, which were now revealed to be partially filled with spidery, old-fashioned writing in what seemed to be rust-red ink. "That is remarkable!" everyone cried. "Not as remarkable as what it reveals," Nancy exclaimed. "Just listen." It would be useless to copy here the rather lengthy document that Nancy read to the amazed little group in the tower room. In brief, it set forth that Asa Sidney was not yet able to summon courage to openly reveal an old secret, but he hoped that someday the manuscript he was writing in invisible ink would be found and deciphered. "Perhaps when it is all written, I shall be brave and forget the curse I brought upon my family, and openly tell what I now put down in secret," read one paragraph of the lengthy introduction. "Sadie Whipple, whom I intend to make my heir, is the only living person in whom the blood of the Sidneys and the Boontons is united," Nancy read. A gasp went around the room, and everybody leaned intently forward so as not to lose a word of the astounding revelations. Sadie's face was white. The manuscript went on to say that Mrs. Boonton's brother, Jeremiah, had two sons, Peter and Arthur. "That's right," the Peter who was present murmured. Arthur, poor chap, was killed in the Spanish-American War. Arthur left a son, John, who went to New York to study art. There he met and fell in love with a young art student, Helen Sidney. Their relatives forbade a marriage. At this point in the reading, Jacob Sidney suddenly buried his face in his hands and sobbed. "Go on," he urged. "Don't mind me." The young couple eloped. Cut off from their family, they started to make their own way. The following year, a baby girl was born. John Boonton had to find any sort of work he could to earn a living, and while engaged as a sign painter, he was killed when a scaffold broke and hurled him to the ground. The terrible fate that seems to have followed our family since my own carelessness took the life of my own baby also took the life of Helen Sidney Boonton. She was killed in an accident, and the little girl wandered off, eventually to be discovered by me in an orphanage under a different name, Nancy Red. That child, Sadie Whipple, is really Sarah Sidney Boonton. To shield her from the family feud, I have permitted the secret of her identity to remain unrevealed, and have entrusted her upbringing to my good and faithful servants, Frank and Emma Semmet, who declare to me that she is being reared as their own daughter. However, someday Sadie must learn her true identity if fate is willing. If it is to be so, then this document will be found and deciphered. Utter silence fell over the room. Then Jacob Sidney arose falteringly and walked over to Sadie. Sarah now. "Your mother was my daughter," he said. "You are my grandchild, if you will ever recognize me as your grandfather after the mean way in which I have treated you, Sarah. I sent my daughter Helen out of my life like a stubborn old fool. I never knew what became of her after she left our home." A few days later, Bess and George and Sadie met at the old house, the former sign of the Twisted Candles, with Nancy. Together they followed the clues Nancy had established, that every twisted candle marked the spot where Asa had concealed something he treasured. Family records, old letters, patent papers, and yellowed clippings by the score were unearthed, besides many a hoard of coins and banknotes. "We must leave nothing overlooked, because the property will be sold in a few days under the terms of the will," Nancy said. "I have been thinking up a plan," Sadie said shyly. "I already have far more money than I can ever use. Suppose I buy the property myself? That will make the shares of the other heirs larger, and at the same time the old homestead will be kept in the family." "Oh, Sadie, what a lovely idea!" Nancy exclaimed enthusiastically. "And at Thanksgiving, you and all the Boontons and all the Sidneys can meet in the old home for the first reunion in 50 years. Which would never have been possible except for you, Nancy," Sadie said gravely. "No, indeed. Without Nancy's guidance from the very beginning, the families would still be enemies, and the Semmets would have the fortune," George said. "Nancy, I'm glad, ever so glad, we are chums again." "And I am too," said Bess, and added laughingly, "It will make it easier, too, for us to watch you solve your next mystery, whatever that will be." And that is something which all of us, who are also Nancy's chums, are wondering about ourselves. The end.